Today we are interviewing Lolly Gasaway, who is the Paul B. Eaton Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina. Laura, who usually goes by the name Lolly, was also the director of the law library at the university, having served in that role from 1979 until 2006. During the years 2006 through 2010 academic year, Lolly served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. She is currently a full-time teaching professor at the university. Lolly, I believe those watching or reading this interview would like to know a little bit about you personally. For example, could you begin by telling us about where you were raised and about your family and life, both when you were young and today? Then perhaps could you tell us about your education, including where you went to college, library school, and then to law school?
Glad to do so, Pat. I grew up in Arkansas, and for the first 12 years of my life, we lived in a number of different towns. When I was going into the 7th grade, we moved to Pine Bluff, and at the time, Pine Bluff was the second largest town in Arkansas. My dad was full-time National Guard and the company commander of the unit there. When we moved to Pine Bluff, we lived in a new housing area that was on the edge of town, and that gave me some advantages that I've always appreciated. So I went to a small rural high school, but in a big town. Now 60,000 doesn't sound so big, but for Arkansas that was huge. So there were 76 in my graduating class in high school, but I had the advantages of a relatively big town. I have a brother who's 3.5 years younger than me. He recently retired as a vice president of General Electric. I have a sister who is 17 years younger than I am, and she is a partner at Ernst & Young in Chicago. Today I live with a partner, Kim Carando, who is a practicing lawyer in Raleigh, and we've been together for 26 years. We have a West Highland Terrier named Hyacinth Bouquet, and live in a wonderful housing area that is on a golf course, but since we don't play golf, we actually back up to the woods and enjoy that area very much. I actually knew from high school that I wanted to be a librarian. Although I had been accepted at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, which is a highly rated small liberal arts college where my dad graduated. But during my senior year, I got some information from Texas Woman's University in Denton. And TWU had the oldest accredited library school in Texas. There were no accredited library schools. There weren't even any unaccredited ones in Arkansas. So I really switched where I was planning to go to school and went to TWU, where I double majored in government and library science. During my freshman year, I took a class, which a required course in the library school, that was sort of a survey of all different types of libraries. And I decided that year that I would definitely become a law librarian, and probably an academic law librarian. That's why I decided, based on that course, that that's what I wanted to do, and some other things that I'll tell you in a little while. And I was hired by the University of Houston as an assistant catalog librarian, and you and I started within weeks of each other at Houston. And when I was hired there, it was with the understanding that I could go to law school. So that's my education and how I got there.
Our director at the time at the University of Houston was Professor Al Coco, who has remained not only a colleague but a really close friend to all of us over the years. You've mentioned that you had sort of decided to become a law librarian early on, and perhaps somebody had some influence in it, but in the decision, but maybe you sort of were a self-starter, so to speak, and so that was the more the way you came along. I know that Al had influence on both of
Oh,
us,
you bet.
and perhaps others have as well. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps his involvement, and that perhaps if there are others
Absolutely.
that played a role in
Absolutely.
sort of molding you into the
Mhm.
law librarian that you became?
I had two influences when I was in high school, besides our school librarian, and I worked in the school library from the time I was in the 8th grade forward. During high school, I was president of the Arkansas Student Librarians Association. And in that role, putting together a program for the state convention, I met Ruth Lindsay, who was the librarian at the Arkansas Supreme Court. And Ruth was a lawyer. And I was very impressed with her, and I began to think about, okay, special librarianship. The other thing I guess I should tell you is I worked one summer as a children's librarian in the Pine Bluff Public Library, which was enough to convince me I never wanted to work with children again. So becoming a special librarian made a lot of sense. The other person I met when I was in high school who convinced me to be a lawyer was Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan had just been elected to the Texas legislature. And I was participating in a race relations conference that the Methodist Church was putting on. And I met Barbara. And I thought, you know, these two women really speak to me. And I was very interested in government and civics, and it just seemed that law and my librarianship interest really coalesced. So I set out to do that, as I said, very early. And Al certainly supported that. I had a lot of experiences that Al helped me with tremendously. For example, I was always able to choose faculty for courses based on work schedule, but Al said, no problem, you take the courses you want to take when you want to take them. Don't worry about your work schedule. I remember when I got the invitation to be on law review, and in those days it was only by grades, and I went to see Al and said, Al, I know I can't accept this because of work, but I wanted to tell you that I was invited. And Al looked at me and said, of course you're going to do it. And I have forever been grateful, because I would have turned down that opportunity simply based on what I thought I needed to do for work. But he made it easy for me. And he always talked to me about, you know, how I needed to do those things and to get active in the profession early on. And I think more than anything, he was a model for how to handle personnel issues, how to deal with the faculty, how to be very service-minded. And I think those are the things that I learned from Al, plus how to be a good person.
Well, he certainly was and is a very first-class friend, and you know, if that means a good person, it means a good person, because he truly is that as well.
Yes.
Now, I remember that I had left Houston and gone elsewhere, and Al decided to go up to Denver, become the director at the University of Denver. And you were appointed to succeed him, I think initially as acting director,
Yes.
and then eventually you were named director. Later, you yourself left the university and became associate professor of law and director of the law library at the University of Oklahoma, and then eventually moved here to North Carolina, where you were in the library for quite a few years.
Yes.
Could you share a little bit about these experiences and these various roles, and perhaps in some of the others that you might have had before you started working as a law librarian?
Sure. You know, I feel like I was always a librarian. As I said, I started working in the high school library when I was in the 8th grade. I worked one summer in the public library, which was an old Carnegie library in Pine Bluff. And then through college, I worked in the library science library, or in the main library at TWU. So I feel like I sort of always worked in libraries. I had other jobs like being a lifeguard and, you know, teaching swimming, that sort of thing. But most of my jobs revolved around libraries. I was so flattered to be chosen to replace Al. The year that I was acting librarian, there was a nationwide search, and we had some very impressive candidates. But the dean and the faculty decided that I could do this. And I was 27 years old. I had not yet finished law school. I had one semester to go. And yet I was named director I finished that last semester, and the day I finished my last exam, I was voted onto the law faculty. So I had had a very good experience at the University of Houston. I used saved vacation time to study for the Texas bar and took the Texas bar. I had to go to Austin to do it then because it wasn't offered in January in Houston. You could take it in the spring but not in the winter, and I wanted to get it all out of the way and be ready to focus on my job. The following year at Houston, we started a new legal communications course, which was what we would today call legal research and writing. And we also accepted an additional 250 law students, so we had 500 first-year law students. And I supervised the legal communications course with 25 teaching assistants and all those students. Now, as you remember, Pat, we actually taught part of the legal research course even before I finished law school. We were doing that. But supervising that large course was a pretty amazing experience. The following spring, I taught my first substantive law course. The dean had said, choose something to teach that relates to your job. And I thought, what relates to my job besides legal research? Oh, employment law. And so I taught an employment rights seminar. At the time at Houston, there were 4 librarians, 2 with law degrees, and during the whole time that I was there, from 1968 to 1975, there were 4 librarians. I was recruited by the University of Oklahoma. And of course, I spoke with Al Coco and with you, I remember, and trying to make the decision about whether to leave Houston. I was very happy there. But after a lot of soul searching, I realized that I would never exactly be an equal with the faculty because of having been a student there. I remember some of the faculty still would refer to me, to Al, as that little blonde girl who works for you. And they would report to him how I was doing in class when he was still there. Mainly this was in my own mind, though, because they treated me great, but I just couldn't call them by their first names, some of them, especially the older faculty. And as I really began to look and think about that, I thought, okay, I do need to grow up and go away, and that's why I chose to go to the University of Oklahoma. The year that I went to OU, 2 women were hired at the same time. We were the first 2 women on the OU faculty. I was there until the end of 1984, and the whole time I was there were only 3 women. The most we ever had was 3. In my 10 years at Norman, I was really able to teach. The library was different than the University of Houston. It was a much older institution. So it had a bigger historical collection than did U of H. We were building a new building. I got to participate in that. The faculty welcomed me with open arms, and I was a colleague from day one. They simply expected that the director would teach. Mort Schwartz had been there and was a very respected scholar and teacher at Oklahoma. I also was able to increase the number of librarians, and I had some great folks that I hired there who became directors. Jim Hoover, Jenny Parrish, John Edwards, and Marilyn Nicely, who has stayed at Oklahoma, but is someone who's rather well known in AALL. While I was there, Lexis came into Oklahoma. Westlaw was not available, so the library added that as something that we taught and worked with. I was tenured at Oklahoma. I continued to write in both employment law, but in 1978 I got to teach copyright as a part of an intellectual property course for the first time, and that's where my real love was as far as substantive law. I was recruited by the University of North Carolina. Again, oddly enough, Peyton Neal was someone who had told me for years, you need to go to Oklahoma, from Oklahoma to North Carolina. And I thought, oh, Peyton, you're nuts. But I knew Mary Oliver well and respected her, and when she was retiring, I was actually recruited here. There was a lot to do here. I served as director for 22 years. When I came in January of '85, the library had no automation whatsoever. There was one Westlaw terminal in the law school, but it was on the faculty floor. So that was my job, was to get us involved in OCLC, to move the Westlaw terminal, to get Lexis, to get computers for the staff, and to begin to move us into really the electronic age. Over the years, one of the things we did was really increase the number of librarians. There were only 4 when I got here. I was the only one with a law degree, although Tim Coggins finished his law degree within a year and was the associate director. And now there are 10 librarians, 9 of whom have law degrees. So there was a real change in the dynamics in going to that. We began to do a lot more teaching, adding several sections annually of advanced legal research, and then teaching substantive courses, not only the director, but the associate director often. And I guess one of the things I'm the proudest of here was that we were able to get clinical law faculty appointments as a secondary appointment for each of the librarians with law degrees. And that's fairly unusual in legal education.
Lolly, many of us in the academic law librarianship world have teaching responsibilities in addition to our administrative ones in the library. You, however, have gone beyond where many of us have gone in relation to developing a reputation as an expert in a particular subject field. In your situation, it happens to be copyright law. Could you tell us a little bit about how it was you decided to and then went about developing this expertise, and about some of the opportunities it has afforded you, both in advising AELL, but also advising Congress and in other work that you have had. Could you talk a little bit about that,
Sure.
please?
I actually had an epiphany moment with copyright. My last semester of law school was the fall of 1973. I took a course called Torts 3. We didn't even have intellectual property at U of H at that time. Many law schools did not. Torts 3 had a copyright section in it. And this was a year for a pivotal copyright decision. National Library of Medicine case that was Gordon and Breach versus NLM. And in that case, a medical publisher sued NLM for photocopying single copies of medical research articles and distributing them to medical researchers. And the lights went off for me. It was like, on for me. It was like, oh my gosh, we really need someone who understands both copyright law and what libraries are doing to be able to explain this. The copyright law was under revision at that time, and we knew it was about to be revised. And I really saw this as my life's work at that time. I know it sounds hokey, but I really did. So I started to work in that area. By 1978, when I was at OU, I was teaching intellectual property. Oddly enough, it was such a backwater that nobody else wanted to teach it. So when I proposed it, it was like, oh sure, no one cares. Go ahead, teach your little IP course. And now what's so funny is it's one of the hottest areas in law. But I've watched this development go from nobody cares to everybody wants to teach it. I'm on our appointments committee this year, and the number of people seeking faculty positions, have PhDs in genetics and computer science, etc., and law degrees is just phenomenal. So anyway, after that, I began to teach and write in the area. And I served on SLA's copyright committee when I was still relatively young. And I was instrumental in getting AALL to have a copyright committee. I chaired it several times over the years. But most of all, I think, how I got to be known in this area was conducting workshops for librarians and college teachers. And it was really to explain the new 1976 Copyright Act, which for the first time had a section dealing with libraries. And when they had copyright lawyers do this, copyright lawyers didn't know what libraries did. And so I was sort of in a unique position. And I wish I had kept count of how many of those workshops I did. I developed an all-day workshop. I still do it some. But I've probably done it many hundreds of times. I don't know if I've reached 1,000, but probably pretty close to it. I got to know the people at the U.S. Copyright Office through some of this work. They would have me in to talk about things. I got to know some of the staffs of Congress sort of dealing with this. And as AALL started having its Washington office, then I sometimes was asked to come and testify for AALL before Congress when there was a copyright issue that was close to our hearts that we needed to talk about. At the same time, I was doing some of that for SLA. I was able to do my scholarship in the same area and to try to write copyright columns for librarians that explain this. And I think it just all sort of tied in together. And probably the most recent experience I had was co-chairing for the U.S. Copyright Office, the Section 108 study group, and working with 2 registers of copyright as they are working to introduce amendments to current legislation that would move us into the digital age with that Section 108.
Lolly, you are the recipient of AALL's highest honor, the Marion Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award, and a member of AALL's Hall of Fame. Could you talk a little bit about some of the things you did to earn these honors and about some of the things that you have done as a leader in the Special Libraries Association, who has also accorded you some extremely high honors in the form of the John Cotton Dana Award. So could you talk a little bit about
Sure.
some of those works
Sure.
and some of the perhaps things that AALL and law librarians really have in common with our colleagues who are in other types of special libraries?
Absolutely. For AALL, I have served on many committees, chaired many of them, including copyright, chaired the program committee in 1978 when Al Coco was president of AALL. And I was president of the president of the association in 1986-87, and as you know, that entails a 3-year stint on the executive board. I've worked in SISs, chaired the Southwestern chapter of AALL, and become more involved with other library associations on the national level as AALL's representative, and even on the international level as the representative from AALL to the International Association of Law Libraries, and to IFLA too. I have published in Law Library Journal several times, and my last article on the public domain won the Contributed Papers Award that year for senior librarians. For SLA, I felt a real responsibility to be active in SLA. When I was going to library school, there were no AALL scholarships at that time, but I won one from SLA, even though they knew I wanted to be a law librarian. And I felt like I needed to become active with SLA. So I did the same thing for them, served on a number of committees, chaired the copyright committee several times over the years, was president of the Texas chapter, active in some of the sections. But SLA had a much more active continuing education program, and my copyright law workshop was one of their programs that they offered for many years. And what was interesting about that is instead of focusing on academic or public libraries, it focused on corporate librarians, which have a very different view and interest in copyright. I published in Special Libraries, which was their scholarly journal, and then I wrote a copyright column for Information Outlook for almost 7 years, a monthly column, and then I ran out of anything to say. I felt like I had told librarians everything I knew about copyright, and I had to do something else after that time. They finally turned it into a book, so I guess it worked out all right.
Sounds like it did, certainly indeed. Lolly, the next question I want to ask is really very special. You and I both had the privilege of working with another person who became, in later years, a very major and significant leader in our profession. I'm speaking about Albert Breck, and he began in the field as a student assistant when we were at the University of Houston.
Yes.
And we both played a role in recruiting him into the profession and then mentoring him in his formative years. I say this because Albert acknowledged that later in life, and I was very flattered, and I suspect you were too,
Yes.
to have him do so. Later, of course, once Albert had finished his education and become a truly newly minted law librarian and then gone on, he became a long-term and very distinguished law library director at the University of Southern California, and a mentor and role model in his own right for many of those who followed him into the profession, especially many of his fellow gay people. Could you tell us a little bit about the late Albert Breck?
Absolutely, I'm delighted to. Albert was one of the best friends I have had in my whole life. We met in 1969. I had started working at Houston in 1968 and started to law school that fall. Albert came in the fall of 1969. Because I was going part-time, we actually had some classes together in addition to his working in the library. Oddly enough, we actually dated some when we were in law school and then discovered each other were gay, so we just turned into being great friends. We remained fast friends until his death earlier this year. Albert was warm, charming, smart, and an excellent librarian. He emphasized service to students and faculty, and having served on an ABA accreditation team a few years ago to USC, the faculty loved the library. And they even said, there's nothing we ask for that the library won't do for us. Albert was one of the early directors who became in charge of information technology as well as the library. And it was interesting to me that he did not view this as a burden. He viewed it as another way to serve that community with which he worked. And so they had a help desk from the very first, and that was unusual. Now everybody does, but that was not true when USC began to do this. And Albert had 2 associate directors, one for the library and one for information technology. He did mentor many aspiring librarians. That is absolutely true, and he was never too busy to talk with somebody about the profession and about what they might want to do. He was active in the Southern California chapter, chaired it, and as a matter of fact, my relationship with Albert continued because he was the AALL president the year after me, so we served on the board together for 2 years. We always got together at AALL and AALS each year and had dinner, and sometimes we'd go to museums together, etc. But we also visited in each other's homes back and forth and stayed with each other as we visited. Albert was someone who loved fine music, museums, art, and he was just so much fun to be around. He had a wicked sense of humor. And I already miss him so much, and I know that our profession will miss him too.
Well, he was truly a very special person, and certainly very kind to me as well over the years. I looked up to him because of his achievements,
Yes.
truly. So he was one of those really hard to replace.
Absolutely.
Well, sort of on that order, why don't I thank you, Lolly Gasaway, for allowing us to visit with you today and for taking these few moments to share so much about yourself and our profession. Before closing, however, is there anything else that you would like to add as we conclude this interview?
Just a couple of things, Pat. I am retiring at the end of this academic year. And I want to say how much I have loved my career as a law librarian. Even as I was an associate dean and then a full-time law professor, I always say we have the greatest jobs in the world. I loved being a librarian, and I still am a librarian. You know, there's no way I can not be a librarian. I would encourage people to consider it as a career. The flexibility that academic law librarianship provides is like nothing else. we have back in the backs of our minds, okay, we can become a full-time law school administrator. You and I have both done that. We can stay as a library director. We can be a full-time teacher. I've done that. But we have those options that most people don't have. They have one thing they can do, and that's it in law schools. And we have this wonderful flexibility. I think one of my greatest joys has been influencing students who all of a sudden during law school realize, I don't really want to practice law, and they decide to go to library school. And we have had a number of those come through the University of North Carolina. We had some at Oklahoma because it also had a library school. I have loved mentoring young librarians, and again, one of my greatest joys is that I've had 7 associate directors who have gone on to become directors. I named the ones in Oklahoma, but I didn't name Ann Kleinfelter and Tim Coggins and Tom French from here, who have gone on to be directors of distinction. And that's been a great joy too. And I think our profession is in great hands, Pat, even for those of us who are retired or soon to be retiring.
Thank you, Lolly. Being a already retired former director now, I can appreciate what you have to look forward to. As exciting and stimulating as the last 45 years have been, there is still life ahead, and I heartily recommend that you enjoy it to the utmost.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lolly.